ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Leader. Warning, this episode contains accounts of bereaved families from COVID, which some listeners may find distressing.
George Shabinsky, Simon James Cole, Sylvia Ivy Jean Harris.
Bereaved loved ones there outside the Covid-19 inquiry, reading out the names of just some of the 220,000 people in the UK who lost their lives.
April Close, Joyce Thomas.
It's been over 3 years since a global health emergency was declared and the country went into its first lockdown. The UK recorded one of the world's highest death tolls from COVID, and now it's time for answers.
As people arrived at the hearing centre today, they found a dignified vigil of bereaved family members holding photographs of their loved ones. Their grief was obvious to all. It is on their behalf and on behalf of the millions who suffered and continue to suffer in different ways as a result of the pandemic that I intend to answer the following 3 questions. Was the UK properly prepared for a pandemic? Was the response to it appropriate? And can we learn lessons for the future?
Chair of the inquiry, Baroness Heather Hallett there giving her opening statement. It will take at least 3 years to fully understand what happened. But at the heart of this investigation are documents, WhatsApp messages, and bereaved families waiting to know the truth. Tristan Kirk is the Evening Standard's courts correspondent.
Well, this is a really important day for everybody affected by the pandemic, not just the people who sadly lost loved ones to the virus, but to everybody else who was affected by lockdowns, by the impacts on businesses, schools, daily life. This is the start of a major inquiry that's going to last at least 3 years, evidence heard over several months, spanned out until 2026, and several reports being delivered at the end of it so that we can really get to the bottom of what happened and why it happened.
Tristan, just how will this inquiry work exactly?
The inquiry's been split up into 6 different modules to look at different aspects of the pandemic, the planning that went into tackling a pandemic of this kind, the impact it had on various different areas of society, and the decisions that were taken at the heart of government and in health bodies and other major state organisations. The first module is looking very much at what happened before January 2020. So the position that there was in the UK in terms of preparing for any pandemic, not just the one that we were struck down with. And so we'll be digging into how the health organisations were set up, what kind of government policies were in place for dealing with a pandemic, and what kind of thought was put into what would happen to all aspects of society in the event that we needed to lock down, needed to control the population, and to try and stop the spread of a virus like this.
Baroness Hallett is leading the inquiry. Who is she exactly, and why was she chosen to be the chair?
Yes, well, Baroness Hallett is a very well-respected person within the legal community. She's a retired judge, sat in the Court of Appeal, very lengthy and highly respected career in the law. She, as with public inquiries tend to be, she's been selected as a retired judge, somebody who can manage this kind of what is a really massive undertaking and can bring a sort of a dispassionate view to all the evidence, be able to distill it down into a report that will deliver its recommendations and be really helpful for us in the future. She's been selected by the government. This is a government set-up inquiry. It's set the terms of reference, which are very wide. And so she's the one who's been charged with bringing it all together, dividing it into the modules and making it make sense for the rest of us.
And the public are being invited to contribute to the COVID-19 inquiry, aren't they?
The public have been invited to contribute. I know there are several groups of bereaved families and people particularly closely affected by COVID who wanted to see more involvement of families and the bereaved in the first stage of the inquiry. But at this stage, the inquiry is asking for people to contribute either online, over the phone, or at various different community meetings that have been set up around the UK to share their experiences so they can feed into the overall picture. But to be honest, the first stage of the inquiry is dealing with things that happened before anyone was actually affected by a pandemic. So they're really looking at the way that government policy was set up and the way that systems were designed. They'll be looking at the pandemic plans that were in place that were maybe more focused towards influenza rather than a COVID type virus. They'll be looking at the impact of Brexit on the government's preparedness for other kind of eventualities. And they're going to be looking at the way that the health system as a whole was set up and whether it was ready for this kind of mass public health crisis.
Let's go to the ads. Stay there to hear more from our courts correspondent, Tristan Kirk, about what the potential repercussions of the inquiry could be. Welcome back. Still with me is Tristan Kirk, the Evening Standard's courts correspondent. Tristan, you've been across everything happening in court on the first day today. What are some of the key standout moments so far?
Well, this is a difficult day and is going to be a difficult time for the government, not just this government, but for past governments, because there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of how the people that we trust to keep us safe and ready for this kind of crisis, how they had plans in place or indeed how they didn't have plans in place. The barrister for the inquiry was outlining in his opening address today how the government and by definition the country was largely taken by surprise by the arrival of the COVID-19 virus and the spread of a pandemic, of how the plans that were in place were perhaps out of date, were not fine-tuned for the spread of a disease like COVID, how there was a very, very muddled setup within the NHS and with the health service and with public health, and how there was apparently very little thought had gone into what we would do in the event of a pandemic and being struck down by this kind of a crisis. And I mentioned Brexit, and that is going to come into focus during these hearings because a lot of time, energy and finances have been put into the possibilities of a no-deal Brexit that we'll all remember from 2018, all of the melodrama that was going on over Brexit and how that would happen appears to have swallowed up large amounts of our resources and the state was focused on that and may well have lost focus entirely on other types of crisis that we always need to be prepared for and we always need to continually plan and update our plans for.
There was also a video with some of those who've been most impacted by COVID. We can actually hear a clip of that now.
When we locked down at work, I said we need to take this seriously to my chief executive. We're going to know people that die from this. But I never thought for a minute it'd be my dad and my sister 5 days apart.
It happened all very quickly. Within 7 days, my mum was gone. Just like that. We missed it. We missed it completely for the few days that mum was not well.
What was the reaction to that video?
Well, it's a strong reaction as you'd expect from a video as powerful as that. It was a video. It was about 17 minutes long. Featured a selection, a handful of people who have been particularly affected by the COVID pandemic, who've lost loved ones, and they were describing their pain, suffering, loss, and for some of them, their anger and confusion at the way that things happened. It was intended to be a video that represented the obviously the vast number of people who've gone through similar situations over the last 2 or 3 years, and just to represent the kind of suffering that people have endured. Some people left the inquiry room whilst that was happening, not wanting to watch a video for understandable reasons, because it's bringing up all kinds of emotions and pain that they've gone through. And just watching it, it was powerful stuff, and it was upsetting, and it was impactful, because these are people who were watching online as their loved ones were passing away, who were denied access to hospitals or to care homes. They were told that their loved ones had died and their personal possessions were going to be incinerated by the hospital. They were given a confusing picture of how the rules worked, and they were kept away. So there's all kinds of issues there that will, over the next months and years, come out through the inquiry, and there will be some of that evidence, I think, brought forward, but on specific topics. This was intended to just give a small flavour of the raw emotion that there still is around COVID and this inquiry. It must also be added that there's a strong view amongst the groups of bereaved families that are represented at the inquiry that there should be more of that evidence at the outset, at the forefront. So there was a vigil staged outside the hearing centre, essentially protesting the fact that Baroness Hallett has not decided to call a lot of the witnesses that they suggested should be part of the first phase of the inquiry. And they say that, that they should have been allowed to deliver pen portraits of their loved ones and the people that they've lost. I mean, it's a difficult balance for Baroness Hallett, because she's keen to recognise that the people who died are at the heart of this inquiry, and they're very, very important to what's being discussed. But ultimately, she's got a timetable to stick to, and wants to get to those important recommendations as fast as possible, and so wants to focus in on what the inquiry is actually asking and what it's actually looking at, rather than spending a large amount of time on things like pen portraits. It is a difficult balance, and it's hard to say whether she's got it right. But at the moment, there's that tension in the inquiry as to whether the families of the bereaved are truly at the heart of the process.
Just what are the potential repercussions from the findings of this inquiry?
Well, this is incredibly widespread as inquiries go, and as you would expect after the kind of major event that we've suffered over the last few years. The first stage is going to be looking at the UK's preparedness, as I've said, and so I think we can expect a series of recommendations in the first report about how Britain should prepare in the future. It was certainly hinted today that we may well need to devote more of our time and resources and finances to preparing for the next pandemic. As terrifying and as depressing as that might sound, all the evidence and from the health professionals is that this kind of thing will happen again in the future, and there will be future crises for us to deal with, and we shouldn't be as perhaps complacent as we were before COVID struck. So that's, I think, what we can expect from the first stage. And then the second stage, we'll move on to the detail of what actually happened in the first wave of the pandemic, so March 2020 and those first few months. And it will look in a lot of detail of what exactly the government did. And that's when the focus will really swing on to Boris Johnson's government, Matt Hancock, the likes of Dominic Cummings, those kind of figures that we all recognise from the early stages of the pandemic. And we'll be looking at lockdowns, Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and the financial furlough support that was put forward. So there's a lot to come in this inquiry, and as I say, it's been broken down into different phases so that there can be different focus. But at the moment, we're looking on what we should do, somewhat depressingly, in the event of the next pandemic, before we'll move on to looking at what we just did in this pandemic.
You can find out more about the COVID-19 inquiry on our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode of The Leader. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.